In this lecture, we're going to be covering the religion of Islam, and we're going to see that it is a religion that is incredibly prominent all over the world today. So, Islam is the second largest religion in the world today. And interestingly, most of Islam's adherents are not Arabs, but instead, the Muslim community is spread all across the globe, but especially concentrated in Indonesia, Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. So you can see just in this map that there's very much a targeted area across the globe where the Muslim population is the largest, and then it kind of extends out from that point and goes across the rest of the globe. So, if we're going to discuss the religion of Islam, we have to talk about who the Prophet Muhammad is. Islam was born out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century when Muhammad started receiving communications or revelations from God. Muhammad is considered by Muslims to be the final messenger in a series of prophets that God had sent to humanity. So, Islam shares a lot of history with the other major religions that believe in the person of Abraham. So, we've already covered those. That would be Judaism and Christianity. So, Abraham, of course, is very important to Islam as well. And so, this becomes important because Muhammad relates back to Abraham, and Islam holds that when God spoke to Muhammad, this was a reawakening, in a sense, of the original monotheistic faith that had started back in the time of Abraham, many centuries between the time of Abraham and the time of Muhammad. So there's a link there, and we see that Muhammad isn't claiming that he is the originator of the Islam faith, but rather he points back to Abraham. So he is recognized by the Muslim community as the final prophet in a long line of other prophets, such as Abraham, Noah, Moses, and even Jesus. So once again, given that we've already covered Judaism and Christianity, all of those names, all of those prophets probably ring a bell to you. Though Muslims believe prophets to be human and not divine, so they don't consider that Muhammad is something more than a prophet. They do see him as incredibly important to the Islam faith. So he was the one whom God revealed the Quran to, and he was a preacher and a teacher and a political leader in the Muslim community. So he is kind of known as the ideal human. So whereas Christianity says that the prophet, the person, the rabbi, Jesus, that he was not just human, but also divine. That's not what Islam claims about Muhammad. Instead, he is fully human. He is just a prophet, but he is also one that lived the ideal life. So the Quran was revealed to Muhammad when starting when he was 40 years old, but it continued over the course of another 23 years. So over the course of those 23 years, God was slowly revealing the Quran to Muhammad. And we're going to, of course, talk about what the Quran is. So, looking specifically at this sacred text, this is the most important text to the Muslim community and is believed to be the literal word of God. So, the Arabic word Quran literally means recitation, which is what Muslims believe actually happened. So, they believe that Muhammad received the Quran word for word from God and then would go and recite it to Muslim followers. So then the Quran was eventually written down. But if you remember us talking about this in some of the other Abrahamic religions, they were living in a time where oral tradition was very prominent instead of having written books and written documents. So the Quran originated from an oral tradition and then was later written down. So the Quran is not a narrative like some other sacred texts of religions are. So, for example, the Christian Bible has large sections of narrative in it. That's not all the Bible is, if you remember that from studying Judaism and Christianity, but there are definitely big portions that are narrative. that's not the case with the Quran. Instead, the Quran consists of 114 chapters, or what are called surahs. And each of these has several verses. So, once again, think back to the Christian Bible that you're probably the most familiar with. It has books inside it, and then chapters, and then also verses in each chapter. So, similarly, the Quran has 114 chapters, and then those are broken down into verses. So then, interestingly, the surahs, or the chapters, are arranged based on specific topics, themes, and time periods. So, one chapter or surah is going to be devoted to some specific theme or about something that has happened. But interestingly, the surahs are arranged not necessarily how they were revealed, chronologically, how God revealed the Quran to Muhammad, but instead they're arranged from longest to shortest. So you have the longest chapter at the beginning of the book and the shortest chapter towards the ending of the book. And then the opening surah, or the opening chapter, is perhaps the most famous of the entire book. And it's the first chapter that many Muslims will study and memorize, often going on to recite it multiple times a day. And it highlights some of the key Islamic doctrines, which is what we're going to look at next. So now, getting more into the theology of the Quran, there are a few doctrines that are really prominent throughout this text. The first major theme is the oneness of God, and you may remember this from the other Abrahamic religions. Islam is another monotheistic religion, and they hold that the one true God is eternal, uncreated, all-knowing, all-powerful, and He is the creator of the universe. He is also merciful, just, and good, and is transcendent and outside of this world, and yet also present in the lives of believers. So Muslims believe that God is the same God of the Jews and Christians. Okay, so we're seeing more in common with Judaism, Christianity, and now Islam. But they believe that the Christian doctrine of the Trinity must be false. Okay, so remember back in Christianity, there was the doctrine of the Trinity, that God is both one divine nature and is three persons: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So Islam claims that that cannot be true because God is one. And so the greatest sin a Muslim can commit is actually recognizing someone or something as God besides the one God himself. So that is maybe the most important doctrine of the Islamic faith. Second would be the reality of prophecy. So, just as in the other Abrahamic religions, prophets play a major role in how God communicates to humanity. And your textbook actually says that each prophet received special words from God that were appropriate for humanity at the time in which that particular prophet lived. So we can think back to several different characters or people in the Old Testament, the shared sacred text of Judaism and Christianity, and then also looking at the New Testament, what Christianity also recognizes as authoritative. And we can see that there were prophets that God used to speak to his people. And so this is similar to what Islam claims as well. So Muslims recognize the person of Jesus that is the very center of the Christian faith. They also recognize that he was born of the Virgin Mary and that he will return on the day of judgment. But as I said earlier, they don't believe that Jesus is divine or the Son of God. So he was merely just a major prophet in this long line that then ended with Muhammad being the last major prophet. The next major theme is the Day of Judgment and the belief in an afterlife. So all Muslims believe that at the end of one's life, each person will stand before God and be judged for how they have lived. And so when a person dies, they will remain in the grave, sort of in a sleep-like state, until this day of judgment comes. So then those who are judged as righteous, they will enter what is known as paradise. And the Quran describes paradise as this lush garden with lots of food and drink and beautiful young men and young women. And then those who have not lived righteously are sent to hell, which is often described simply as the fire. Finally, another major theme is the existence of angels in the Quran. Angels are part of God's creation, but they're believed to not have a body and to not have a gender. So angels are believed to be messengers or some sort of assistant to God. You may remember from the Abrahamic religions, specifically Christianity, the most well-known angel in the Islamic faith is Gabriel or Jibril. And this angel played a major role in the revelation of the Quran to Muhammad. So if you remember, an angel named Gabriel played a role in Christianity as well. But here, the Islamic faith holds to Gabriel helping reveal the Quran to Muhammad. So that's different from the Christian belief. So now I want to talk a little bit about some other sacred texts or pieces of literature for the Islamic faith. The second most important piece after the Quran would be the Sunnah, and this refers to the tradition or the way of life of the Prophet Muhammad. So this includes things such as how he dealt with conflict, how he treated his wives and friends and children, and really just how he went about daily life. Even if you remember from your textbook, even silly matters such as how he went about brushing his teeth. So that makes up kind of the second most authoritative text. The one immediately after that, kind of the third most authoritative text, would be the Hadith. And this is a form of literature that records in brief reports just little snapshots of details in Muhammad's life. And this would include things that he said or things that he did. And the interesting thing about the Hadith is that it specifically quotes from those who were close to Muhammad and observed his life. So like his wife, his friends, his companions, all of those who were close to him and observed his life, they wanted to remember his actions and his words and then pass those on through the generations. So it was basically like notes were taken about the person of Muhammad, and then those were passed down to future generations. So you have the Holy Quran, which is the by far the most authoritative text, and then you have after that other pieces of literature as well. So I just want to show you a few pictures that you may have already seen in your textbook, but I think they provide a good glimpse into the Muslim community. So this first one is a cubicle building that is actually in Mecca. It's very important as far as Muslim celebrations go. And what's interesting about it is that many Muslims believe that this was built by Abraham and Ishmael, his son, in order to be dedicated to the one true God. Then I think some of these, there's just some really impressive architecture. So this is a mosque, which you would have read about in your textbook, kind of a place of prayer. This one is in Turkey and was built in the 1600s. It's an example of the time of the Ottoman Empire. And you didn't have to read about that in your textbook, but that was a flourishing Muslim community for quite some time. So there's this just really awesome architecture in Turkey. And then you have the Taj Mahal, famous architecture in the world today. You have this as originating from the Muslim community as well. And then you also have this mosque that is in Iran, and it was also built in the 1600s. So really, really impressive buildings that they have that are kind of part of Islamic history as places of reverence where people can go and pray to God. So then also this is just an example of daily prayer that Muslims take part in, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. But this includes kind of as some of the other religions that we've studied, that prayer is not just um, this act of the mind, but is also kind of a whole body practice. And so here we see a man kneeling with his head bowed to the ground in prayer. And then finally, here is Muslims as they pilgrim all the way to Mecca and prepare for prayer in the mosque as part of their celebration. So now moving on, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the practices of the Muslim community. The 5 pillars are the 5 most important practices that a Muslim should do in their religious life. So some of these pillars happen more often than others. For example, prayer is something that we're going to talk about, but it is something that is done daily. If the Muslim is devout, they'll be doing this at least 5 times daily. Whereas a pilgrimage to Mecca maybe like a once in a lifetime thing. So just kind of keep that in mind with these practices. The first listed practice is by far the most important, and it's kind of set apart because it's not like this ritualistic practice that Muslims do, but rather is a statement or a declaration affirming the key doctrine that we talked about earlier, the fact that God is one, and that there's no one besides him. So, all a person has to do to become part of the Muslim community is to sincerely make this declaration of faith in the presence of some witnesses. So, that's the first pillar. Next is the 5 daily prayers that Muslims do. So, these are different from maybe a prayer that we think about in Christianity that's just something kind of, off the cuff talking to God. Instead, these 5 prayers are said every day, recited every day at specific times. And this is just a way of showing one's commitment to interrupting their day, whatever they're doing, and praying to God and showing that submission to God is the most important part of their life. So then, almsgiving, this is an interesting one. This refers to the giving of basically of a tax, and it's based on the value of a person's property. So this money then goes towards bettering the community or helping the poor. So this is something that all Muslims are expected to give. If you're familiar with Christianity, you maybe have heard of how Christians will often tithe when they go to church. So this is kind of like that, but it's based on the value of the property they own. And whereas a tithe going to a church is going to be used, for the ongoing activities and the things to support the church, the almsgiving that the Muslims do is based more on not just a church or a building, the furthering of something like that, but instead goes to helping the community and giving to the poor. So then fasting during Ramadan, this occurs every year, and it's basically throughout this whole month celebration. So Muslims refrain from eating, drinking, and sexual activity during this month and only do these things when the sun is down. So if the sun is up, they're not eating. They fast all day. And this practice really just shows a commitment to God and a commitment to being dependent on him to just meet their everyday needs. Finally, the last practice is a call to make the trip to Mecca in Saudi Arabia at a specific time throughout the year. So all Muslims who are physically and financially able are expected to make this trip. So you can see how that may be a once in a lifetime thing to, if you are a Muslim living in the United States, that's going to be, quite the trip to get back to go to Mecca in Saudi Arabia. So now just looking at the Islamic year and holidays. You have the Islamic calendar, and then from that, we have, as we've studied in all the other religions, some important dates throughout the year. The first is the Feast of Sacrifice, and it commemorates, going back to the person of Abraham, it commemorates that Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac to God. Now, if you know anything about this story, God kind of called Abraham off before he actually did, give his son Isaac as a sacrifice. But this is pointing to Abraham's willingness that he actually would have gone through with it to, to help with that relationship between Abraham and God. So then also you have the Feast of Fast Breaking, and this occurs at the end of the fasting period during Ramadan. So of course, lots of eating there after this very strenuous time of fasting. So now talking about Islamic law. This is something that comes not just from the Quran, but also from the Sunnah and from other sources as well. So this law is very detailed, and it regulates almost every aspect of daily life for believers. Studying the law is a really important part of Islamic education today. And interestingly, for those that go on to kind of become experts of the law, they are given a special place in society. So, some nation states actually have Islamic courts where some family issues such as marriage, divorce, things like child custody, those can be addressed actually in those Islamic courts. But otherwise, Muslims seek to live according to the law in their personal lives, even if they don't live in a part of the world where there are these Islamic courts established. Now, just thinking about kind of family life, marriage, and the whole family unit. For Muslims, marriage is a contractual agreement. So, a contract is signed and a gift is given to the bride, and usually this is some kind of monetary gift. And of course, this gift can the amount of the gift can vary. Regarding polygamy, there are some verses in the Quran that deal with this matter. So this issue specifically has led to a whole lot of theological discussion about whether a man can actually treat multiple wives equally. So with that said, most interpretations of Islamic law, they do allow men to marry up to 4 wives under the right circumstances. So a man is able to have up to 4 wives. And interestingly, polygamy is legal in most Muslim countries, but there are some exceptions, and that's becoming maybe a little bit less common today. And then finally, the Quran and Hadith literature lay out several types of divorce that are permissible, that are viewed as okay. One example is unilateral divorce, and this one's pretty interesting. According to classical Islamic law, a man can decide to divorce his wife without any say-so from his wife. So he needs no consent from his wife, and he needs no consent from a legal authority. So today, this is becoming much less common and is not near as accepted in Muslim countries. But in the past, based on how the Islamic law has been classically interpreted, this was something that was very much common practice. And then divorce carries a different connotation from one Muslim country to the next. So in some countries, there's really little to no stigma associated with divorce, whereas in other Muslim countries, the couple that is divorced are basically shunned, and it's really difficult for them to remarry. So as with all of the religions we've studied, there's always a little bit of variation in how the religion is practiced and kind of how adherents live out those beliefs. So then looking at the role of women in the Islamic faith, given the historical context that the Quran was born out of and kind of the world in that 7th century time, the Quran introduced many new rights to women, such as the right to own property, the right to refuse marriage, along with some other things. So, Islamic belief states that men and women are equal before God and they'll be judged by God on their own accord. So, equal value before God. But there are a lot of variations today regarding a woman's role in society. So, for example, the Taliban, they are far more strict than in other Muslim communities, and they don't allow women to work outside the home, to be educated, to even walk alone down the street. So that's an extreme example, but there are also, some the other end of the spectrum where women have a lot more freedoms. One thing, modesty is a very important practice encouraged in the Quran for both men and women. So there are a lot of variations or interpretations of Islamic law when it comes to how modest a woman should dress. And so, of course, we see once again that spectrum of some being really strict about this and some being not so strict. But modesty is very, very important to Islam. And then there have been many reformers, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, that have tried to improve the status of women in Muslim countries and try to give them more freedoms. And so that's kind of an ongoing thing in today's society, and I'm sure will continue. So now, coming to the end, kind of wrapping all of this up, how can we summarize this religion? So, looking first at ultimate reality, Islam holds to God being the creator and the sustainer of the universe and the world and everything in it. The elements of the beautiful natural world, so just this natural creation all around us, are signs of the existence of God. Humans learn about ultimate reality through God's revelations. So you have kind of this natural revelation of the created world, but also they are communicated to humanity through the Quran and through prophets. And then finally, the Quran is the source of God's teachings about the nature of ultimate reality and the nature of the world. So if one wants to know about God and how to follow God, then they are to look to the Quran to answer those questions of ultimate reality. Second, how should people live in this world according to the Islamic faith? Humans are, of course, part of God's creation, and so they should live accordingly by worshiping God, being generous, and living righteously. The life of the Prophet Muhammad, he is, back to what we said earlier, he was the example of the ideal human, and so he is an example for Muslims on how to live. And then the 5 pillars for Muslims are kind of the worship practices that they engage in and are really the foundation for how they go about living as adherents to this faith. And then finally, according to Islam, what is the ultimate purpose of humankind? So Muslims believe very much in an afterlife and this day of judgment. And they believe that those who have lived righteously will enter into paradise, whereas those who have led sinful, unrighteous lives will be cast into the fire, into hell. And God will judge each man and woman independently based on how they alone have lived. So then devout Muslims aim to live righteous lives, to practice those righteous practices, and submit to the will of God, and of course follow the prime example of the Prophet Muhammad. So that kind of sums up the religion of Islam. I think you should be now good to go.